the slow movement. You know them, yeah?
Yeah. We talked a little bit about them yesterday.
Yeah. Oh, good. Okay.
Well, thank you for agreeing to talk with us. And
all right, yeah. So first we want to ask you, what does sustainable development mean to you?
For me, sustainable development is an organic process that occurs at the community level, and that it's a little bit of a redundant phase, because I would, instead of saying sustainable development, maybe I would emphasize on organic visions of development, which are inherently sustainable. And I guess that sustainable development to me also evokes some sort of an engineering perspective that very often, let's say, loses the sustainability as part of the development. So to me, if you're looking at development from, let's say, a very mechanical perspective, then it's impossible to be sustainable. So there's a contradiction in terms from that perspective. And I think that other authors are talking about that too.
Thank you. So, growth is something that's essential to the sustainability of a movement because it ensures that there's a constant input of knowledge, ideas, and resources. However, many small movements collapse before or soon after they begin. How did the Pink Saris grow from the one woman to a widespread network without collapsing soon after initiation?
Okay, well, I guess that this comes from the three elements that we talked about, which is the aggregation of both positive and negative feedback loops, and also an element of resilience that is going to allow any influence from the outside, any shock from the outside, to actually be absorbed by the movement. So the more complex the movement are, the deeper the ties are in between the people. And here I'm not talking about numbers, I'm talking about a really complex social fabric. So the more complex the social fabric is, and the more it is able to show resilience in form of shocks. So if you remember, while facing shocks, if you remember, we talk about the turbulence, then the structure, and then the constant. That's something I hadn't developed by the time I spoke to you, but now I have the constant flow of the structure as well. And what I see is that let me see what this is. Turbulence. Oh, forget it. What I see is that for the turbulence to actually move from an aggregation to a structure, so you need the combination of the three, and then you need the structure to be in constant flow. So in that sense, this is how then you find, this is how an aggregation can lead to the formation of a network, basically, the emergence of a network.
So what role do you think that women like Sampat play in sustainable development?
I think that they are, looking at organic development, they are at the core of it, and they, she doesn't ask herself, what am I going to do for development in my area? This comes from almost a survival mode, which makes it organic, of course. So I say that she plays the most vibrant and also seminal role in that anybody can play in development. So by facilitating what women like her are doing, I think that everybody has a role. We have a role, she has a role as well, but again, she's the one building out of her own life, which is something that none of us can do.
Do you mind if I interject?
Oh,
just
yeah,
another question?
go.
Do you think women specifically have any advantages over men when it comes to sustainable development, or just something different to offer that?
I'd say that the network, I mean, remember when Jay and Sampat meet, and Jay is actually using women, and not using in a bad way, but utilizing women to actually to actually set up those different, they set up that network of different, groups of women. So I'd say that in the way they relate to one another, um, there may be some elements that belong to that community. But again, we have to question what makes a woman what she is. And here you have gender elements of, let's say, socialization. So maybe the socialization of women that is more focused on elements of care, nurturing, and so on. I mean, the way we actually understand what it is like to be female in this world, maybe this is going to be more useful to this organic vision of development. So by addressing gender issues and adding to, and let's say breaking this masculine feminine kind of barrier almost in construction of life, there can be also an enhancement of, let's say, development. And if we think about, societies that have actually a lesser occurrence of conflict and a higher, let's say, understanding of development. And here I'm not talking about North and South, but we can also look at indigenous communities. We see that the communities where men and women have are more tending towards equity are the communities that are the most successful. So there's a book that was written by Nicholas Kristof, I think it's called Half the World, and he talks about those groups, those development groups that actually are relying on women. So I think, no, Half the Sky it's called. And you should really read it if you haven't yet. It will answer that question much deeper.
It's really interesting because like gender is really such like a social construction that gender like design characteristics can be a social construction, and equity can be just as much something that can be like achieved. So
yeah, I guess, and by raising men, telling them you have to be tough, violent, and everything to actually, the problem is, though they are the ones who call the shots because they rule us, and keep us as a minority. So in that sense, the equity from that perspective would lead, I think, to less conflict and so on. But it doesn't mean that men are inherently more violent than women. Those social roles. Yeah.
One question I have is are there any obstacles in women's socialization besides men, or is it just gender roles that are getting in the way?
I think it's gender roles that are getting in the way, and the hierarchy of gender divisions, because we're not only looking at roles, because we see already that also that in the developing worlds, for instance, women there's also a hierarchy of women. So here in Costa Rica, the lowest will be the Nicaraguan woman working for the Costa Rican woman, who is then able to work in the bank and so on, and has so eventually, I hope that answers your question. But that's what we need to look into. That the construction, the domination system of layers that the patriarchal system actually imposes on us.
So in a sense, like organic or sustainable development is like kind of depend on changing cultural norms that relates to gender, but like who has the responsibility to go about doing that?
Absolutely. Absolutely, because I remember, going to an NGO in Beirut to interview them when I was doing my PhD, and it was a women empowerment development NGO. It belonged to the former First Lady Neila Mouawad, and then I get a 13-year-old Ethiopian girl serving me coffee. Obviously a slave. And when you look at it from a migration and human trafficking perspective. And then they tell me, and so I asked them, where's this girl coming from, and so on. And they're like, oh, we're helping her out. She's sending money back to her family in Ethiopia. So from their perspective, they were developing. And they were empowering her gender-wise. Interesting.
I mean, it's definitely challenging too, because a lot of other societies have seen feminism as like a Western like version of imperialism. So it's kind of hard to like reconcile like the idea of like gender equity with like maybe it is kind of something that's seen as like a Western like meets resistance.
Exactly, and you can understand that with the Ethiopian girl example, because then people in Ethiopia, they're like, okay, that's what gender is. It is, or a certain vision of feminism is. It is reiterating a certain hierarchy. Yeah.
Oh, so for the Pink Stars, do you think small groups are the way to go to start doing sustainable development?
I think so, definitely. Empowering those small groups and having a different set of lenses to actually see them, first of all, because with the theoretical tools, the classical theoretical tools that we have, we do not see the invisible. So enable ourselves to see the invisible and then to facilitate whatever the invisible needs. Yeah.
Okay, one like criticism of kind of the small localized approach to development, it's that it may not always be sustainable if it lacks coordination with other organizations. Has the Galabi Gang been able to integrate coordination to like their operations in order to ensure sustainability?
Does Sampat have problems with the NGO?
Yes, of course. I mean, the NGO is calling the shots and feeding off her, but not really bringing her anything that she needs. So that's the biggest problem. I guess that let's say, if you look at a structural formation that could have helped Sampat, it would not necessarily have been another NGO, but it is, she's working within the parameters of the Indian state and the Indian legal system, and she's also working within certain social parameters that she's calling upon. So it's from that perspective, yes, other levels of the social structure have a lot to bring to her in terms of sometimes protection, sometimes legitimacy. But when we talk about holistic development, it's that relationship between the different levels and not having one level prevail over the other or utilize the other to sustain itself, such as what the NGO is doing.
Have you seen that type of case in other countries, like NGOs causing problems with ongoing development?
Of course, in Somaliland, I've seen that in Somaliland. I've seen, actually, interestingly enough, I gave a class in Somaliland about that particular subject and course, and I had many members of parliament in that class, in that course, and the Speaker of the House told me, we have peace in Somaliland because we made it ourselves. We didn't need the international community, and we know that the day the UN comes in to help us is the day we will start fighting again. So that to me was, the kiss of death.
So we've kind of seen examples of how like NGOs or like outsiders interfere with development, and just from our discussions, we've gathered that organic sustainable development must be something that's like initiated by like an anomaly that pops up within the system, rather than imposed by like outsiders to the system, because that's something that's prescribed rather than inherent.
Absolutely.
But is it like really responsible for the international community to just wait for an anomaly to pop up? Like, what if one never pops up?
The anomalies are already there. The problem is we don't have the tools to see them and to recognize them, but they're everywhere. I mean, now I have, now I've started to look at the world in a different way. It's as if there is a parallel universe that I never saw before. So they're there already. It's about looking for them and finding them.
What are some things that you can look for? Like, if you're gonna go about this like transformation perspective from like the global mindset?
I'd say have an understanding of what organic systems are, first of all, from your perspective. So be armed with the tools in a way that allow you to see those contexts. But I would say time. Have a lot of time on your hand. And this is one of the if you look at, there's a book written by David Bohm. He's a physicist. David Bohm. It's called On Dialogue, and it actually tells you before entering a dialogue, suspend your assumptions, be fully there, present, and listen. And I think that the best thing I've ever done, and in the proverbial field, is to have the time to listen. If I don't have the time, I just don't go in, and it's as simple as that. And David Bohm makes the distinction between what's a dialogue and what is a discussion. When you discuss with someone, you already think